Well, thank you for staying in this room after, a day and a half of heavy work. And thanks to the team that has been supporting us in facilitation. I think that we are seeing how this gathering is progressing as we pass from one moment to the other. And for this moment, I think that I would like to welcome our friends, Jerusha and Jalila. I know that they have a hard time in traffic, especially in the past 40 miles and so. But we are very happy of welcoming you into our community. You will see people that will be walking into the room as they are arriving now. And to give you a sense of what we have been playing with, we started yesterday this journey that we, as you are familiar with, called Within and Without, Liberation Theology at Work in Social Movement. And we have been exploring the methodology of liberation theology, of the seeing, the judging. We will see the acting and the celebration on Sunday. And as we are exploring together, there is no a single recipe here. The only recipe that we wanted to maintain very open, to change ingredients as we go, was we want to do a interfaith experience that all of us can build together the world that we are dreaming about. So it is with that in mind that I invite you to share with us your experience. I won't read everything that I already shared with you about Jerusha. So I really invite you to read, this piece of paper that you have in your packet. But just to read the first sentence, Jerusha is a Muslima theologian, a scholar and public educator. And we know how important this is for the work that we do, to have people committed to public education and to the work of bringing theology from the academy, as we know it, into the hands and the heart of the citizens that work every single day in our street. So, Jerusha, welcome to our community, and this mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I feel somewhat self-conscious of the fact that I am joining you on day 2, and then, of course, joining you on the evening of day 2, and it is 7:30 going on, however late we will be here. So thank you so much to everybody who organized the program, to Lena and Francisco and everyone, and also to all of you for being here. I look forward to getting to know you all. I've met some people already, just briefly. My intention is to share a little bit this evening on my most recent work, and then to have plenty of time for conversation, to hear about what you are doing, what we might think about together, new ideas, as will become very clear, I think, very quickly. I'm one of these people who fiddles with the chords nonstop, so I'm going to try to push them to the side without... Okay, it's good, don't worry, Francisco. What I've been doing, one thing that will become clear is that my work is somewhat inherently interreligious. And so the liberative possibilities that I have been and remain committed to exploring are those that are not just within my own specific traditions, but also precisely on the overlaps and intersections of traditions. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Muslima theology, which I'll define, but I'll just tell you up front, is a form of Islamic feminist theology. I'll give you a few more specifics, or general specifics as I like to call them. But I also want to say that what I'm going to talk about tonight is guided by two ideas. And so Francisco said that I am a theologian and public educator, and tonight I'm going to do a little bit of both. But one of the things that I would like to do is just foreground two guiding principles to my thought and my work, because that will make it clear where I'm coming from. And I suspect that in this audience, these will not be shocking guiding principles, but nonetheless, I like to make them explicit. The first is that, in my perspective, theology and praxis or action are always connected. That can be an implicit connection or an explicit connection, but I do not subscribe to the perspective that they are disconnected, so that we should just be doing action or just be doing theology. I think that every action that we take is informed by some kind of theological, ideological, philosophical, or particular worldview. And we may be more or less conscious of that, but we are taught those perspectives through our socialization, through our religious communities, through our ritual practices. They are ground onto our bodies, and we learn the language of them, even if we're not taught the explicit theology. And so I am a theologian, and I love theology, I won't lie to you, so I'll try to stay away from the weeds, and I know there's many people here that do as well. But I love it because I think it's necessary to understand and target and think about constructive, rooted, transformative, and provocative rearticulations of theology in order for there to be real change within communities and among communities. And so the second thing that I will just foreground as a guiding principle is that, and I will speak about this more in depth, is that in my perspective, interreligious engagement is not a nice thing, nor a fun thing to do on the side, but that given our context and our world and our global issues, that it is something that is absolutely necessary. And in fact, the painting of it as an interesting add-on after we've solved all the problems within our tradition is perhaps a reinscription of certain hegemonies that would like us not to work well with each other. And so with those two guiding principles, I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit. They're good weeds, don't worry. So my goal tonight is to introduce Muslima theology, and then to focus on the comparative or interreligious component of it, arguing for the necessity and value of interreligious feminist engagement in particular. I will discuss a bit about the why, the how, and the what of my work. Why, meaning why I think this work is necessary, especially coming from my unique positionality. How, meaning the methodology and approach that I argue for and use in my most recent work. And what, a specific example of just one constructive element of this comparative Muslima theology. Let's begin with what is Muslima theology. Muslima theology is a label that I use to describe my work as a Muslim scholar, theologian, and activist. This label arises in conversation with, not rejection of, diverse formulations of feminism. While I consider my work to be feminist, I'm also interested in asserting particular characteristics of my location, approach, and concerns. Therefore, I use the term Muslima, which in Arabic means a female submitter or a female Muslim. I use this term to highlight my personal positioning as female identified, as a Muslim, and as an individual committed to the critical reappraisal and interpretation of Islamic tradition in pursuit of justice and egalitarianism. I also use this label to highlight my theoretical positioning as a scholar who draws upon gender theory and feminist discourses to interrogate the value assigned to various forms of human difference, including, but certainly not limited to, gender and biological sex. The approach of Muslima theology is simultaneously constructive, theological, and comparative. The first two characteristics, that is the constructive and the theological, are already evident in some existing work of Muslim women scholars. And I'm happy when we have time for conversation to talk into that space if people want to know more. I haven't centered that work today, but if it's something people have questions about or would like to explore, I'm happy to do that. The value of the constructive and theological aspects are recognized, as is the need for their further expansion and integration. The third characteristic, meaning the comparative or the interreligious aspect of Muslima theology, is novel, it is new. However, I will argue in this talk, it's not completely new, and it's likely invaluable. So let's talk about why. Muslima theology is both an intervention and a response. As an intervention into ongoing It is an intervention into ongoing and ambivalent debates over the relationship between Islam and feminism. This relationship, for those who know, is complex. There are many Muslim scholars who fervently promote women's equality. Ambivalence, though, arises from the concern that dominant forms of feminism and feminist theology are not expressive of and potentially oppressive to the experiences, challenges, and liberative strategies of Muslim women. In this way, ambivalence is connected to an assertion of identity, autonomy, and voice that seeks to highlight diversity among women and among religious traditions. Ambivalence, though, is not simply an assertion of identity, autonomy, or voice. It is also a position that is adopted in reaction to various discourses that emerge from outside of and from within the Islamic tradition. These include external critiques of Islam that are grounded in notions of cultural superiority and that propagate negative stereotypes of Islam and of Muslim women. These critiques can give rise to efforts that ostensibly aim to improve the situation, and by the way, the situation, typically homogeneous and singular, of Muslim women, but rarely attend to the actual voices and concerns of diverse Muslim women. Islam is portrayed as the other, as backward, as devoid of egalitarian possibilities. Muslim women are portrayed as being in need of rescue from Islam and from Muslim men. As a result, rigorous and extensive efforts by Muslim women to search for and reclaim egalitarian resources within Islamic traditions are ignored and dismissed. From within the Islamic tradition, ambivalence is fueled by the existence of patriarchy and androcentrism, that is, male rule or dominance and male normativity. As part, although certainly not all, of Islamic tradition, these realities results in texts and practices that enshrine, normalize, and operationalize hierarchical views of humanity. They result in attacks on and rejections of interpretations of the Islamic tradition that promote egalitarianism, equality, and women's rights. Such interpretations are often labeled feminist. These like bunny quotes, by the way, bunny ear quotes, right? Feminist, Western, deviations, and here's the kicker, un-Islamic. The authority of egalitarian interpretations is effectively undercut by presenting such interpretations as external impositions upon a pure Islam. Muslim scholars are well aware that their work can be dismissed and, more significantly, rendered impotent, meaning incapable of changing anything, when it is caricatured as a product of external forces. Keep in mind, external forces that have a concrete, historical, and contemporary record of negatively approaching Islam and Muslims. These external and internal discourses append specific and frequently oppositional definitions to Islam and feminism, and they thereby seek to define what counts as an authentic or real expression of Islam. In doing so, they fuel the ambivalence of Muslim women scholars towards feminism in general, and thus also obscure valuable possibilities, specifically those related to interreligious feminist engagement. They pit women and various formulations of feminism against each other. They capitalize off of superficial knowledge of traditions and of feminisms. And they convince many women that such conversations are of abundant risk and little benefit. Why does all of this matter? Because Muslima theology is also a response. It's a response to growing calls within Islamic feminist and egalitarian scholarship for new constructive methods and approaches. As scholar Hiba Abu-Dughari observes, the deconstructionist approach remains the dominant method of Islamic feminists. This means critiquing and aspects of the tradition, so pointing out where the patriarchy and androcentrism is located, perhaps even where it comes from. The deconstructive approach remains the dominant method of Islamic feminists. Part of the reason for this relates to the limitations of academic disciplines in which many Muslim women scholars in the United States are situated. And it remains true that much of the Islamic feminism in the US context has been born out of the academy. And the reason why is one of the only places that has offered a foundation from which women can do their work, because most communities are not yet supporting that. Not because they might be completely opposed to feminists, but because the structure within Muslim communities remains patriarchal, and so leadership roles go to men. And so those have not become places that offer the foundation or home base from which to do this work. So it is the academy in which most Islamic feminism in the US has been articulated out of. This positioning is not only always amenable to activist scholars or scholar activists or scholar theologians who advocate constructive possibilities related to Islam, women, and gender. Deconstructive challenges to patriarchy and hegemony are invaluable. Yet constructive rethinking is also required for egalitarian interpretations to become more robust and transformational, more liberative. In line with more recent contributions from Amina Wadud, Aisha Chowdhury, and Saadia Sheikh, new constructive approaches that go beyond textual interpretation, historical reclamation, and identification of past egalitarian precedent must be articulated and implemented, not only to contend with negative stereotyping and male dominance, but also to articulate new ways of asserting authority within and outside of the Muslim community. It's my contention, and certainly a central piece of my current work, that interreligious feminist engagement is a vital resource for developing one such new approach. It is a theologically legitimate and practically necessary resource. Interreligious feminist engagement can be a rich source of insights in the ongoing development of Islamic feminist theology if, and there's always an if historical, comparative, and epistemological challenges are identified, confronted, and skillfully navigated. So how? How do we do this? Is there a method or a form of engagement that would mitigate against common challenges and open doors to meaningful interreligious feminist engagement? My paper says the short answer is yes. We're going to go with the medium-sized answer. And the longer answer is my more recent book, but I'm going to go somewhere in the middle tonight. So the answer begins with the acknowledgement that interreligious feminist engagement is not actually new. More pertinently, it has not always been a productive endeavor. We must acknowledge the challenges and realities of much interreligious feminist engagement, especially Muslim Christian engagement. As Aisha Hidayatullah and Zain Qasim Aqli note, while assumed to be beneficial, Muslim Christian engagement can be a site of harm and jeopardy due to power and structural issues. It is often characterized by language and concerns being drawn from or determined by Christian traditions alone, a framing of rivalry, this is the Sarah Hagar framing, myths about liberating Muslim women, and a persistent lack of knowledge across traditions. All of these create expectations and assumptions of parity or sameness across traditions. For example, that Muslim and Christian women would have similar questions about and approaches to their respective scriptures, the Quran and the Bible. Despite these very real challenges, interreligious feminist engagement is both theologically and practically necessary. Theologically speaking, and I've written about this in my first book actually, and I'm not going to go into detail on it, but essentially what I come to at the end of that long walk through the Quran is that the Quran is describing the existence of multiple religious traditions, of religious diversity, not as just a fact, but as something that is divinely intended. In fact, the Quran is describing religious diversity as an ayatullah, which is a beautiful word that gets somewhat trampled in our context. It means sign of God. It means something in the created or natural world or even within human beings that when contemplated, teaches us something about the divine that we could learn no other way. So if religious diversity is being described in the Quran's kind of important for Muslims. This is where I add my caveat. Okay, we can talk about how specifically. I might talk about that in a little bit. But if it's saying that it's not just there or existing, but it's intentional, it's an ayatullah. If traditions are described in this way, then there is an imperative to engage that diversity beyond mere tolerance or valuing. This book is, my recent book, but also my work, is very much motivated by that theological imperative and justification. There is something to be learned from and amidst diversity. Perhaps I can rephrase that to say, there is something that can only be learned from and amidst diversity. Practically speaking, since interreligious feminist engagement is already happening, sometimes implicitly, sometimes unnamed, and sometimes premised upon unproductive caricatures, Islamic feminism is embedded in an inherently comparative setting. For those of us who work in the US context, there is simply no escaping the comparative backdrop. We will engage with it in some way, whether that will be passively, poorly, or productively is perhaps the only question. Since comparative engagement is going on, strategies for explicit and conscientious comparative and interreligious engagement are necessary. The question is not whether to engage, but how to engage. It is a question of method, of approach. On a more positive, practical note, there is something, many things, to learn. While it is accurate that hegemonic and universal or imperial feminism stifle the agency of diverse Muslim women, diverse women period perhaps, it is also true that this is not the whole reality of religious feminisms. There are many scholars and theologians who have critiqued these forms of feminism and articulated other variations such as womanism, Muslima theology, African women's theology. And they've done so due to very similar concerns as those voiced by Muslim women scholars. This alone indicates that we have so very much to learn from each other. The specific how that I propose is the approach of comparative feminist theology. Comparative feminist theology builds critically upon the general method of comparative theology. Defined by Francis X. Clooney, who is a Catholic theologian, comparative theology describes acts of faith-seeking understanding which are rooted in a particular faith tradition, but which venture into learning from one or more other faith traditions, and here's the important piece, for the sake of fresh theological insights. Comparative theology is the double process of venturing out of one's own tradition or traditions to learn deeply about and from other traditions, and then returning to one's own tradition or traditions with new insights, questions, and perspectives. More specifically, it is a process that begins with deep learning about the other on their own terms. Then, and only then, limited acts of competent comparison, and then constructive theological reflection. Comparative feminist theology follows this basic process with a few key modifications. First, it centers what Michelle Voss Roberts calls the outsider within traditions. Rather than insider orthodoxies, it focuses on feminist discourse, texts, and practices, by the way, and also rituals and aesthetics. That's the expanding edge of this field. Second, it revisits the way in which the fruits, the fresh theological insights of comparative engagement are received by and resonate with the original tradition. Communal resonance is important, and in early comparative theology, it was the standard by which to assess if you had done good theology. Would your community accept what you had learned through the interreligious encounter? Now you can begin to understand that communities don't tend to accept much that comes from feminist theologians as the central piece, never mind, so resonance needs to be reconfigured. And so communal resonance is important, but feminist theologies are more interested in provocative communal resonance. That is, in stirring people, in poking people enough perhaps, to embark upon difficult yet imperative conversations. Third, comparative feminist theology is especially attentive to expectations of parity in concerns, methods, and theologies. So if we are looking too much for the ways in which we are the same, if we are centering only on commonalities, if we are homogenizing each other in order to pretend that we're all the same, then this is a big concern in comparative feminist theology, not only because of the way in which it harkens back to imperial and universal feminism, but also because it is the differences from which we learn. Okay? It is not just the overlap. The overlap is the beginning of the conversation that enables the bigger conversation. But if it was all the same, not only is that factually inaccurate, it doesn't reveal anything new or have the potency to reveal something new. Fourth, comparative feminist theology does not avoid all grand narratives, as is often asserted by early comparative theologians. Comparative feminist theology aims to use theological insights and to foster deep solidarity and to further pursue equality. There is a goal, although that goal will be variously defined and perhaps continuously redefined. So in the comparative theological process, we understand ourselves in new ways in the light of the other. It is important to emphasize that this does not mean that the objective is appropriation, direct co-optation, or abandonment of one's own tradition or traditions. It is an assertion that we notice new facets of ourselves, of our traditions, our sources, and our practices when they are illuminated by comparative engagement. In fact, one of the analogies that is used for the process of comparative feminist theology and comparative theology is being in a room such as this, and you can imagine you see there are different lights, some of these recessed lights. And this can be your room, it can be the room that you have sat in for your whole life. But the idea is that when you engage with someone who is enough similar, but then also very different, that it's akin to having a new light turned on in your room. You see, it's your room still, but you'll see different facets, different shadows, different textures, different corners, things that you might not have paid attention to. And so I'll talk a little bit about how that happens concretely in a second, but this idea of the light illuminating new features of what you have experienced before. New facets of ourselves, our traditions, our sources, our practices. We ask new questions of our traditions, and we discover patterns hidden beneath the grooves of well-worn narratives. The stories we know so well become a little less familiar than they were before. People tend to ask us questions about the things that we think sound so familiar. Our language, our framing, and there's something to be learned there. We see new possibilities. Of vital importance in comparative feminist theology, we are prompted to imagine new legitimate and rooted options beyond dominant forms of theology, interpretation, and practice. The comparative lens assists in penetrating what Muhammad Arkoun calls the unthought and the unthinkable. That is, those possibilities within our own traditions that are obscured by dominant formulations of orthodoxy and interpretations of texts and practices. The goals of comparative feminist theology, therefore, are transformation, transgression, and imaginative theological reconstruction within and in conversation with the traditions of the comparative theologian. At the same time, comparative feminist theology provides a way to learn with other traditions. Learn with other traditions. Not just about, not just from, with. And to gain new and indispensable insights related to egalitarianism and liberation. Interrogations of power, attentiveness to on-the-ground realities, and a thrust towards liberation become empowering aspects of comparative feminist theology. Engagement among traditions becomes a theologically sound, theologically rich, and practically effective means of change. It reveals new resources crucial to our own struggles. Rather than a distraction or a side project, comparative feminist theology recasts interreligious feminist engagement as an invaluable resource for reflection and for action. So we turn to the what. I'm going to give you a concrete example of how this looks. Two of the most helpful aspects of the method of comparative feminist theology, which I'm also happy to go into greater detail on, but two of the most helpful aspects of the method of comparative feminist theology are, one, that it is premised upon deep knowledge. So it's not something that you embark upon without having spent time to learn about the traditions you're engaging with. And two, that it is not premised upon expectations of absolute parity or sameness. So this is where the value of difference comes in. So why does this matter? Simply, it allows comparative feminist theologians to identify better points of analogy, better places to start comparative conversations. So in my recent work on Muslima theology, the unique starting point, and this is the concrete example, the unique starting point that I take up is the reorientation around the analogy of the two divine words. Now I should mention that this work is Muslim Christian primarily, that I'm going to talk about here. So it's the analogy around the two divine words, that is, centering comparative theological reflection and engagement on the analogy between the Quran and Jesus, instead of the more common alternatives of Muhammad and Jesus, meaning the central figures, or the Quran and the Bible, the scriptures. And I should say engagement, what do we mean? Well, I mean everything from theological engagement to interreligious textual examination to scriptural reasoning to we're going to do some kind of protest and organize around a theme, and I say, hey, do you have a verse from the Quran? Because I have one from the Bible, and we think that that is a similar parallel in place. And so what I'm proposing is that in fact is not a good analogical opening, and it betrays a lack of depth into the knowledge of the both traditions and how they're functioning. This is not a wholly new comparative analogy. In the US context, Syed Hussein Nasr identified it in the 1960s in his book Ideals and Realities in Islam. And notably, those who employ this theological analogy are mostly men, the few that touch upon it, except for Anne-Marie Schimmel. She mentions it in passing in her book on Muhammad, which is a fabulous book, by the way, but it's about the ritual practices surrounding Muhammad, so it's very fascinating. Not the practices he did, but practices people do, about him. Notably, though, those who do employ this theological analogy do so on the basis of their deep knowledge of both traditions and their frustration with what they call a confusion of categories that occurs with other analogies. This analogical starting point is deeply relevant to and fruitful for comparative feminist conversations among Muslim and Christian theologians. Why? Because when one looks at this analogy, the analogy of the Quran and Jesus, from the perspective of the diverse concerns voiced by theologians, overlap is readily discernible. What are their concerns? What are their primary sites of struggle? What questions disturb them? The diverse responses to these questions reveal something striking. They point back to the analogy of the words. Even when the terminology or the concept of word is challenged, mostly by Christian feminist theologians, concerns in both traditions swirl around questions of the divine being in the world in all of its contextual messiness, and the way that value has been assigned to various markers of that worldly messiness, such as maleness, such as patriarchal forms or androcentrism. More concretely, similar concerns are raised in relation to the Quran and Jesus Christ, questions about divine inbreaking in a limited worldly/human form and context, questions about historical contextualization and universal relevance, questions about patriarchy and maleness. Based on this organic, albeit productively imperfect, overlap in concerns, the analogy of the two divine words becomes an invaluable place to start a new conversation. In my work, I take this through a variety of systematic theology areas, ranging from divine ontology and revelation to text and how we deal with text, to compare feminist exemplars using Mary and Prophet Muhammad, placing them in conversation to think about how, especially a lot of the Christian and Latin American work on Mary illuminates the way in which the gender Prophet Muhammad is functioning. Maybe I should have talked about that example. Maybe I just talk about that example. I was going to talk about something else, but I'll just go off track and we'll talk about that. And so this is a concrete example. When one identifies a better analogy, not based upon the expectation that, oh, this is a book and this is another book, so they should be the same, and people in the traditions are going to be having similar concerns and engaging with those in similar fashions, that's not actually accurate. But if you use the analogy of the two divine words and you start with the comparison of Quran and Jesus, it begs a question. You can walk through all that work, which I'm not going to talk about right now. It asks the question, well, if you're going to place the Quran in conversation with Jesus Christ, then what might you place the Bible in conversation with? And so what I do in my work is I do comparative work between biblical hermeneutical techniques and approaches, exegetical approaches, and approaches to the Hadith. Now in Islamic feminism, for those of you who know, maybe many of you don't know, but I'll just tell you, you can trust me a little bit. Hadith, which are written narrations about what Prophet Muhammad said, did, or approved of, they're very important. They are the details of Islamic practice and Islamic social existence, and they're very contextual, but they're also very necessary. So they're very much tied to his context and his persona, but without them, you cannot even pray Islamic salat. All of that comes from that source. And they have been a source that Islamic feminists have yet to grapple with. And so engaging with diverse, especially decolonial exegetes such as Musa Dube, who are reading in biblical hermeneutics, those techniques are readily applicable to dealing with hadith. And they open up a whole new avenue. I'm not talking about that. But then if we stretch that a little bit, I'm not going to talk about any of that. But then it just dawned on me that, I should talk about like Latin American context, and then it'd be fascinating to do that. Because it comes in conversation with liberation theologies, right? Because a lot of the Latin American-based feminist critiques will be of liberation theologies ignoring gender as a screen, right? So the next step in this analogical move is to say, well, are there other similarities? And so what I argue is that there is a similarity between Prophet Muhammad and the Virgin Mary. That these are both the thing which bears the word of God into the world. And Prophet Muhammad is, his sunnah, his example of behavior is really important to Muslims in terms of practice and for all Muslims, and that's accepted kind of across the spectrum. And I don't contend with that. I'm not interested in arguing against that. That's more of a polemical move. What I'm interested in is looking at the ways in which we have or have not grappled with his gender. And so in many discourses, even Islamic feminist discourses, the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad is often used to rail against patriarchy. So Prophet Muhammad didn't do it so you shouldn't be doing it. That's a deployment. But there's very little engagement with gender or sex or anything of this sort to talk about it. But when put in conversation through the comparative feminist theology lens with discourses on Mary, so Mary as liberating, Mary as pure and virginal, Mary as being like other women, or Mary as being completely not like other women. And for those of you who may know some of this literature coming out of Latin American context, coming out of Brazil, the debate goes both ways, right? Mary is either the closest to women who are struggling, the closest to poor brown women, or she is the alien who is nothing like any women, or the colonial handmaiden who, wears the skirt. So Alpheus Reed here will have a lot to say about Mary, who is just deployed, on imperial whims. I mean, she has some very colorful language, so I encourage you to read that. But what becomes fascinating in this discussion is that because of the reorientation of the analogy, it opens up this whole new terrain of comparative engagement. And in my own work, what it leads to is there are fascinating overlaps. For instance, Mary, we will know, many of us in this room will know, that the purity, the virginity of Mary is a very important feature. It's a theological, okay, so maybe that was very diplomatic. It's a theological assertion, right? It functions in theology to say a whole bunch of things about Mary, but also a whole bunch of things about God, and a whole bunch of things about Jesus, right? Now here's the very interesting thing is that Prophet Muhammad is referred to over and over again as being illiterate. Now that sounds like, what are we talking about? But illiterate actually within the context of the Sunnah, or within the context of Islamic theology, does not just mean you can't read. It means you've been untouched by previous revelation and untouched by other traditions of revelation. And so the parallels start to come out, and it reveals this whole parallel discourse. Now what starts to happen is there's another characteristic that's assigned to Prophet Muhammad, and it's called isma. Don't worry, don't have to know that word. But it means that he was kind of like infallible, but not really infallible. It means that he was protected from great moral error, so that God would protect him as with other prophets from great moral error. So he could make a mistake, but then he'd be corrected, chop chop. Like that's not the right thing. So maybe we should clear. No, don't go there. And this is how most people talk about it. And Islamic feminists talk about this characteristic, but through digging through the comparative feminist engagement with writings on Mary, what begins to become clear is that Isma is not just a moral assertion. It is appended to bodily purity. And so Prophet Muhammad has this characteristic that most prophets have in Islam, but it's not just his moral perfection. It's moral perfection that rests in a particular type of body. And if you walk the walk down a few steps to what kind of body that is, it's a body that can never fall out of ritual purification, which means it's a body that will never experience menstruation. And so these levels come. And so my interest in doing this is not to discredit the value of Prophet Muhammad's example, because first of all, it's functionally impossible, and second, it's something I value. But what the point of the exercise is to reveal the way in which gender and sex are functioning, and also the way in which when we invoke the Sunnah or his example without paying attention to the fact that those things are functioning, we actually create a situation in which there is a hierarchy of people being able to participate in or emulate his example. And so my interest is, I don't want to deny that gender's there. I don't want to present him as being a generic human. He is not a generic human. And in fact, a lot of the theological assertions made about him are akin to the purity assertions. In fact, I mentioned Anne-Marie Schimmel. She is one of the other people who mentions this analogy. But in this book, she just has a number of places where she doesn't explain, but makes comments that are ripe for the picking. And one of the comments is she talks about people hanging pictures of the Virgin in their house. but especially Guadalupana. And she says, and that's like the Hilya. I don't know if people know what the Hilya is, or it's a calligraphy writing of the description of Prophet Muhammad, so his physical description. But there's also another thing, which is, it looks like an abstract sandal, the print of a sandal, and people hang that in their house for protection and for blessing. And so there's these strange ritualistic overlaps. But none of this is part of the Islamic feminist discourse. And not because Islamic feminists are not doing great work, they're doing fabulous work, they're doing rigorous work, they're doing life-changing and saving work. But it's only from bumping in to another person's conversation, from overhearing it, from understanding it within their frame of reference, that it raises new questions about one's own tradition. And let me be very explicit here. My questions about Prophet Muhammad are not the same questions as about the Virgin or about Guadalupana or about whether she's familiar or whether she's complete imperial imposition or whether she desexualizes women. Those are not the exact same questions, but there's enough provocative overlap to incite new conversations that aren't even happening within my circles. But be clear, it's not that there aren't good conversations happening. And it's not my place to dictate what conversations people in other traditions will have. Those are for people from amongst those traditions inside. But I'm sure there would be equally as many insights for people coming from Christian contexts or other contexts to learn from the Islamic discourse on this topic. But it only happens on the methodological groundwork, right? It only happens if we don't jump ahead steps, because sometimes we want to jump ahead steps, right? We want to have the comparison before we've even taken time to know anything. And that is the fail-safe here. So the reason why I set up this conversation by talking about the tensions and the stereotyping is that this work is done in the context of Islamophobia. And it's done in a context of explicit Islamophobia, but it's also done in a context of implicit Islamophobia, where people are just like, they have no malintent, but it's so hardwired into assumptions that, people ask how you speak English, and people ask if your husband dropped you off at work that day. Because we're taught that. And it's funny and it's awful, but it's also, we're all socialized into it, right? It's in the water. And so the importance in having a methodology that can mitigate against that, but still allow us to be in productive conversation, because some Islamic feminists are just, I don't want to have anything to do, especially with dominant traditions. Because you will stereotype me and dehumanize me with one move, and then it'll come to my thing. But I don't want to give up on it. I've had too many insightful and provocative changes to my theology as a result of engaging with other people's traditions that I don't want to give up on it, so it becomes a question of methodology. How can we do it better? How can we learn? How can we then put that into some kind of constructive action? Then I'm just going to conclude, because I've gone on for a while, and say that I've talked a lot about theology today, but I want to go back to my first point that I made. Theology changes lives. Good theology changes lives. It's one thing to claim equality or liberation or say people are free or equal. It's another thing to know your theology well enough to shake the foundations of your tradition. And that is really significant. And I think from my perspective, it's something that I have had the experience of from being in comparative feminist and interreligious conversations. And I just think it is something that is imperative for us all to engage with. So thank you very much, and I'll stop talking. We'll kind of talk.
I think that you will stop talking. I have a bunch of questions for you. So, it is important that you are speaking to the mic, because we we continue, recording this section. So you raise your hands, and I think that John has the first question, and I will pass the mic to him.
Thanks, and then I'll pass the mic from here. Thank you so very much for very provocative talking points. I think I have dozens of questions, but the one that keeps popping to mind is when you were talking about communal resonance, which raises for me the question of what is your community of. I mean, you've talked about the discourse that you are having interreligiously, intertraditionally, but what is your community of faith that feeds you and supports you? What is that source for you?
Yeah, it's a great question.
And then the communal resonance is, what community are you speaking of for it to resonate within?
Right. And so I'll be honest about this in two ways, and I know there's some people in the room who may have similar sentiment, but I think for me the community is twofold in that I feel, and I like to talk about it as community of accountability. So it's community of sustaining too, so that's also important, and sometimes it's not the same. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a smaller community within a larger, and so I consider my community to be the broader U.S. Muslim community. I'm active in Muslim communities in New York City. I draw sustenance from that. I think it's very important, but I will not lie and say it's always good. And I think many people who do theology and are scholars, but also people who are committed to practicing, find that tension. And what I've seen in my life is that it ebbs and flows. And so for me, there's a necessity to be in community. And in fact, so this comes to the resonance question, and also maybe I would frame it more as a why and for whom this work is for. For me, it's for people whose voices are not being heard within Muslim communities. And so part of my work is kind of trying to make people stand down and let Muslims have a conversation for a second, even if it's an interreligious conversation, but a conversation with some agency that isn't all about explaining our humanity, but is about doing some other work that will actually help communities. And so the final topic I talk about today is I talk a lot about ritual change in mosque settings. And I have to be, I have certain feelings about the way gender functions in space. Again, that it's mass. I am an advocate for female leadership within mosques from a theological perspective. But this is just a very good example to answer your question. Why? Because I want to see healthy communities. I want to see my students who come in who are Muslim not feel horrible about the experiences they've had. And that could be because they're female, it could be because they have different abilities, it could be because they're gay, it could be whatever number of things, or because they're black or whatever. And that still happens in Muslim communities that are mostly people of color. There's still racism. And so my community accountability is there, and also of sustaining is there. But this is what I will also say. I have at least a dual community in that my community of interreligious feminist friends and scholar activists is of great support and sustaining spiritually as well as just intellectually.
Wow.
And so that is modeled. And so I have an accountability to that too.
Thank you so much. That's very rich. Thank you.
And I think that piece is, just as you're moving the microphone, that piece of feeling accountable to the people that you're engaged with is important, because again, it helps to mitigate against slippy or sloppy learning, right? When I write about womanism, that is not my stuff, but I feel indebted. And I also feel that it's the canon, and so I want to present it in a way that people I'm writing about will say, yes, that's what I was saying. And so that's accountability.
Thank you. Do you want to call on people, because you can see hands and I was up front? Other folks who have a question or a comment or... I just knew you would not disappoint me.
I don't like I wish, I don't even know, I have a lot of feelings right now, and they're all good feelings. So I just want to say that. Thank you. I feel honored to be in your presence. I feel honored to receive your wisdom, and I want to say I've been waiting all day for this. So, thank you for bringing me into this room and making me visible. That's what I want to say.
Well, thank you for the same thing then.
I've been waiting all day too. And it's really wonderful. I've had the opportunity to learn with you before. And I wanted to ask you to go back to what you said about the Sarah and Hajar and about the rivalry model. And I was wondering how would you teach those texts in Torah and in the Quran?
Yeah, so I think it's, I'll be honest, I was, in the talk, what I'm drawing upon is what is commonly referenced as one of the obstacles, and that is a framing of rivalry, and I think that it often happens when it is a framing of certain dominant, because certainly not womanist reads on those texts, but it's other Christian reads and Muslim reads that happens there. And so actually, one of the ways that I'm not completely sold on that being a bad framing, but I actually think it's a problematic framing when it's bilateral. I think it's much more interesting if it's at least a trilogue of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because it makes it much more complex. And so the conversation is just much more complex. So I think there is a lot of pushback on the framing because it's true that it's not just the text themselves, it's what has happened with the text over history. And so there's been a whole, there's been hundreds and hundreds of years, not recently, but of polemical writings, based upon this division, and so that's where you get the Hajarines and the Hajarites and all of this kind of stuff, and that is where part of the framing of rivalry comes on. I think actually maybe engaging directly with the text is one of the answers, and then doing it in a non-bilateral way is another part of the answer. Some of these headings that we like to put over things because we think they group us into some familial relationship, sometimes don't group us in great ways. But actually looking at the text, I think, is a fabulous thing to do. And illuminating. So I'll just give an example. I teach a comparative feminist theology class, shocking. And it's usually Christian, Muslim, but often I have students that come from Jewish theological seminary to sit in the class, and I have to say that the perspective, especially on those texts, is always enlarged and made more productively complicated by having it in that conversation, because the trauma, not that people are looking for more trauma, right? But the trauma and the suffering, there's a lot to go around, right? And it's hard to just say, you're the victim and you're it spreads it out, and so there's more learning, I think, that happens.
So I spent a lot of my adult life in Indonesia, which is primarily an Islamic country, and I do a lot of translating for people. And I try to get them to look at each other and talk to each other, and I just try to do the language. One of the few times that it isn't possible is when people from outside Indonesia try to ask about the treatment of women, Islamic women in Indonesia, and they don't get it. They don't even get the questions. And I have to stop and kind of explain it. And the Indonesian women's response is, oh, no, that's Saudi culture, that's Arab culture, that's not Islam. And so for them, it's like totally like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about. And so I was just wondering, what your experience is within an a North American context, and how that sorts out as the theology moves to practice. And how do you deal with that?
So with the questioning, or how do I think that people respond to the questions? Or what do I think is actually going on?
With the confusion, is that a confusion that goes on in North America? Is it clear within the Islamic community itself, or do they start superimposing these and assuming a lot of things that are basically Arab culture are actually Islamic? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for clarifying. So in the U.S. context, which is wildly diverse, so I'm always very hesitant to talk, and of course I don't know all of it, and so I can just point to some general things that I know are operating, and you should all know that they will operate differently in diverse communities and be made more complicated by various other factors. And so what I would say is that, is there a confusion between certain cultural norms and Islam among Muslims in the U.S. community? Yes, that's absolutely true. When I said before, for instance, that there's racism active in Muslim communities, and there's a great organization called Muslim ARC that does a lot of anti-racism training for within Muslim communities, so that's a shout out to them. But one of the ways that functions is because of cultural normativity. So it is racism, but it's also racism appended with the idea that Arabs are the cultural norms. And so speaking Arabic, dressing in a certain manner, all of those things get woven in together with Islam, and can be read as being more authentic, more authoritative, by the way, right? So, I kind of wearing jeans, fancy jeans, so where I came, I kind of dressed for the occasion, they're dress jeans. But this isn't going to be read. This isn't going to be read as authoritative, according to those normativities. I would need to dress the part, and that does happen. Now, here's the other piece, though. I'm also somewhat suspect of the attempt to distinguish culture and religion. I don't think that actually works very well, and I think that what is a better goal is to become more hyper-attentive to the ways in which culture is being played out religiously over and over again. So Indonesia is a great model, right? Indonesian Islam is very Indonesian cultured, even to the point that, there's the recognition of things that are not recognized in other parts of the world, but culture plays into religion wherever it's lived. So I'm not so much interested in extricating it. The third thing and final thing I'll just say on this really briefly is that it's not all norms. I mean, there are things in the tradition. The tradition was born into a patriarchal context. And so there are sources and texts and practices that are at minimum androcentric, which means that they assume a male audience or assume a male as the center. And so that is part of the tradition that needs to be grappled with. And it's a different strategic move to grapple with that than to grapple with, well, this is your cultural norm. That's a different process. Most of my work is grappling with manifestations of inequality and patriarchy and androcentrism that come from the sources and texts and context of origin. I'm interested in that. But religion is lived, so you have to also be interested in how people actually live it. Right. Just here's a quick example. Muslim feminists, all the great early work is done on the Quran, reinterpretations of the Quran. Fabulous, again, life-changing, soul-sustaining work. And I mentioned before that hadith was pretty much left alone, but what I didn't mention is that the Quran was prioritized, and that makes sense theologically, it makes sense communally, for all sorts of reasons. It makes sense in terms of stature of that text, in terms of authenticity. But what happened is, it wasn't just that hadith were ignored, it's that hadith there are some very androcentric and patriarchal hadith. And so what early Islamic feminists did is they said, look, the Quran is egalitarian and that's the most authoritative. And no one is disputing that because the Quran is most authoritative. It's a very good strategic move. It's fine. And then these hadith are not as authoritative. Now that move makes all sorts of strategic sense theologically, textually, all sorts of, but here's the problem. Hadith are what kids are taught in stories when they're little, and they're the details, and then they're narrative, and so that gets ingrained and inscribed, and so you kind of have to tackle that, even if, my response to some of patriarchal hadith is, oh, they're contextual hangovers, but it doesn't excuse me from doing the heavy lifting of trying to work through it.
Yeah.
Because I can just pretend like, oh, they're leftovers, but then people are still operationalizing them. So you have to sometimes get into that. All the time get into that. Not sometimes. There was maybe a hand over here at some point, half a hand. Okay, maybe I'm making it up. Maybe I'm just prognosticating. There's a hand over here.
You got me.
Thank you. I'm very ignorant about Islam and pretty ignorant about liberation theology, so I probably should ask a question about liberation theology and Islam in this context, but I'm going to. So, as I understand liberation theology, it's a school of thought within Christianity that says that God has a preference for the poor, and that finds in the Christian scriptures that there is a call for liberation for the poor and the oppressed. Is there a similar school of thought in the diversity that is Islam that is calling for the liberation of the poor and the oppressed?
Okay, so this is kind of I have enough off. It's a great question, and I have kind of a shorthand answer that maybe I'll give second, because it's a little bit maybe late at night. So here, there is Islamic liberation theology proper, but it manifests slightly differently. It's not only concerned with the preference for the poor. The preference is writ larger, and so a great example of this is free zakat. And that doesn't mean larger, meaning like it's better. It just means that it's not only specified on the class of people that would be considered the poor, or that kind of the class lens, class critical lens, and that is very important. But so in Islamic liberation theology, I just used Friedrich as an example. His lens is broader, and the reason why it's broader is that it's drawing from the Quran, and the Quran has a class of people that it calls the Mustafa Din or something, and it means marginalized. But it doesn't just mean poor, it also includes other classes of people, so it includes often women, and I would like to say that isn't necessary anymore, but it remains necessary. It includes orphans, it includes people who are traveling, it includes traveling, meaning, you can build out what that will mean, but it also includes people who are poor. So it includes all those, and so he's going to build his liberation theology out of that, and that's what people do. And so it takes on a slightly different lens than that, but it is similarly rooted in text, and it is similarly claiming that God has a preference. But let me be specific about how the preference plays out. It's not just that God has a preference, it's that God has command. This is how I would phrase it without co-opting the language of especially Latin American liberation theology. I would frame it from an Islamic standpoint is that people have an obligation to care for the marginalized. And that obligation, that would be more Islamic language, right? The obligation to care for people who are marginalized. And so that obligation, interestingly enough, is not general. It is very specific, and it is manifest in ritual practice as one of the primary places. So one of the ritual practices of 5 that people will say you have to do is zakat. It's payment of a portion of anything you possess or any money you have. Now I think in contemporary terms it's 2.5% of anything you've kept for more than a year. And that has to be paid to support and take care of this group of people. But it also manifests in other ritual practices, such as in Ramadan. Ramadan is fasting, right? But if you can't fast, you have to feed. people who are hungry. And so I like to point to the ritual part because that's the embodied, there's a very embodied component to it. And that's the framing. And that is the obligation, and that forms the foundation of liberation and feminist theologies across the board. And that is paired, the only other piece I would add is that is paired with a theological assertion that your obligation is to care for the marginalized, but the reason why that obligation does not get fulfilled, there's a diagnosis of the illness. And the diagnosis of the illness is a diagnosis often referred to as arrogance, but it's not really arrogance. What it is thinking oneself independent in the sense that you think that everything you have is yours and you got it on your own, and I worked hard so I got this stuff, and if you just work hard you could have stuff, so I don't need to take care of you, and oh, where's God? Oh, nowhere. Forgot about that. And that is an illness. It's actually called an illness. And so there is the obligation, and then there's the diagnosis of why we fail to do that. And in fact, the Quran, this is kind of going into textual theology, but the Quran talks about, the biggest, not sin, but the biggest problem humans can do in the face of God is something called shirk. And most people think this is polytheism, it's associating partners with God. But we use this word, right? Shirk, like shirking your responsibilities. But it means to associate things with God, meaning put things on the same level as God. And the reason why I bring that up is that liberation and feminist theologians, and even now people who are working into like the queer theology space of Islamic theology, all claim that these human hierarchies that make us think we're independent and make us forget God and make us forget the marginalized are all forms of shirk. Because what they're doing is they're elevating some humans above others, and there can be no elevation in that way. And so there's an interesting theological, textual thing, but it's a great question. Thank you.
I saw yours, but you were pointing to him. Okay.
I was just curious, I mean, I'm sure there may be many, but maybe you could share something with us about, in particular, ecofeminist, Islam ecofeminism, and because I know there's a lot of really great ecological thought within Islam, and I'm just curious how that plays out in terms of kind of an ecofeminist thought.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because I think it's a growing edge. So you're asking this question and I'm ticking through my mind to think of someone who's written, a book or even a lengthy article on this topic from an ecofeminist perspective. And I know people who do work in it, like Nana Furman, who does work in California on this, on Green Muslims work, and then with other coalitions. And I know Keisha Ali has written some stuff, including an article that goes into some eco territory because it's talking about vegetarianism, and it's actually talking about meat and gender, which is fascinating. Like about meat eating and okay, so there's a lot of stuff. Those are the first two things that pop in mind, and of course I may not have read something or overlooked something, but written from a specific Islamic feminist standpoint, I don't know if there is anything in the U.S. context, but I bet there is in other contexts. I bet there is from other parts of the world. And so I don't know that the person who asked the question before about Indonesia, I would be shocked if there wasn't stuff coming out of Indonesia or Malaysia or something from an ecofeminist standpoint. I'm not as familiar with it though, but that would be a fascinating terrain to go into because there is part of. Okay, so I'm just going to go on a little tangent here because it's interesting. Okay, so, one of the reasons why work on environmentalism from an Islamic standpoint, Islamic theological standpoint is fascinating is because my work is in two fields. It's a lot to do with feminism and questions of gender and sex and things of that, but it's also more broadly concerned with topics of human difference. And so my first book was on not feminism, but it was on religious diversity. So on what the Quran has to say about religious diversity, and is it a mistake? Should we be getting rid of it? Is it corruption? Is Islam only right and no other traditions are wrong? Working through all of that. So why am I bringing that up? Because remember before when I mentioned ayatullah, and I said that there's signs, right? Well, all of those signs are in nature. And those of you who may know something about the Quran will know that each verse, we don't like to call them verses, they are called ayah, which means signs. So every verse of the Quran is an ayah. And if you take some time reading the Quran, or you have read the Quran, you'll notice that a lot of those textual or scriptural ayah point to natural ayah. So we'll say things like this. The Quran this is Quranic ayah, and it says, if you want to understand the resurrection, then just look to the world and look at the ground and how it grows and becomes dry. And so there's all this referencing to the natural world. But it's all done in this language of ayah, right? The reason why I brought up religious diversity is because the Quran has a critique of certain behaviors. I was just mentioning some of them, so shirk. But the other way that these behaviors are referred to as are people who deny the ayatullah. They might deny them, they might try to cover them up, and worse comes to worse, they would try to destroy them. Now, if we're not talking about just revelation in terms of scripture, but we're talking about the other ayat in nature and people who try to destroy them, cover them, lie about them, there's a whole real fruitful theological, eco-theology terrain there. I have not written into that, but I have, well, who knows what comes next. But ecofeminism, now I'm going to have to go look, so it's a great question. Yeah.
I'm just going to make a little comment again, because that's really interesting to me because my experience with Islam is in Indonesia primarily, and their background is a rice goddess worshipping culture, and so their orientation, one is a lot of their cultures are matriarchal, but their orientation is to the land and that description of the land, and so their reading, their language tends to circle around and go into, and then come back to the nature, and then go into the people and back to the nature, which I think is a lot of the way that Quran is written in some ways, like you were just describing, but it gets emphasized, I think, it rises up because that's their natural cultural storytelling is to cycle through that. And they're both oral tradition, like they're both sung traditions, right? So it probably maybe has something to do with that also.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there is a woman who does a lot of work in Indonesia, Anna Gee, and her earlier work was on Quranic recitation. Yeah. But there's especially female reciters of the Quran, which are very popular in Indonesia, but absent. So we were asking about cultural norms, absent in parts of the idea that a woman would recite in public would be, strange in certain parts, but in Indonesian, whatever, I mean, that's normal. The best reciter in Indonesia is a female. But the reason why I bring this up is that her work is also focused on, there's a crossover there with environmental activists. So some of these people doing this are doing environmental activism. And so she has a whole website on the work that she's doing there, recording narratives and doing on the ground ethnographic research around kind of like environmental activists. Yeah.
I've been amazed by your talk. Thank you so much.
What is your name? Sarah. Siri likes Sarah.
What I'd like to order up is actually a description of sort of your life journey and how you came to where you are today, but I know that there's no time for that, but I wonder if you've written about that as part of your writings or anything like that.
I don't write about it. often. I think I've done some interviews about it, which are probably part of, accessible online or via my website. Is there a particular aspect of it that you're interested in?
Maybe if you grew up in Islam as a child and how that all played out,
Okay.
what brought you into scholarship?
Yeah, so no, I did not grow up in Islam. Islam is something that I started practicing late teens. And I don't like to use, I have done an interview on this with Robert Wright, in fact. There's an interview on his, on Meaning of Life TV where I talk a little about this. I don't refer to it as conversion. That model kind of theologically is different. It's not the standard Islam like reversion either. I just think that it was something added to my existence, not a total change. I didn't grow up in a family that was actively religious. In fact, they had been raised religious and had scars from those experiences. And I somewhat grew up as someone who was antithetical to religion. I just, the classic caricature trope of intellectual versus belief, and I thought I was so smart about that. It's really funny in retrospect. Yeah. But then when I ever like a challenge. I ever like a challenge when I see it. If I don't understand something, I walk towards, not away. That's my disposition. I know that's not, we all have our own dispositions, but that's mine, I hear something I don't understand, I want to understand it. It's a language, I want to understand it. That it interests me. And so, but when I was in college, I was sure that what I wanted to do was international politics in sub-Saharan Africa. That was going to be my calling. And then I realized that the sub-Saharan Africa part was my calling, but not the politics was not my calling. And so I realized very quickly that what I was interested in was ethnography. And so my path into religion and into Islam, in fact, is via indigenous West African traditions and living there and doing research on the ground among interreligious, so indigenous, Muslim, Christian, other communities in primarily Ghana. And seeing religion lived was very pivotal. So seeing people, and also being in a context, so you were asking about culture, being in a context where my time in Ghana was so transformative in terms of just having a different lens of experience from the US on many fronts, on race, on religion, on a whole bunch of fronts. But on religion in particular, it's even to today, it's a place where religion is lived out loud. I mean, really out loud, like really, really out loud, and kind of everywhere. And but families are interreligious and people get along, and so people might even say like you're going to hell if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, but then be like, oh, that's the call to prayer. Here's a prayer mat. Like it's a very, very weird jumble. And for me, it was very provocative in that it was a different possibility and a different model of how, and so that was pivotal for my investment in interreligious engagement, I think. But I started as an ethnographer. When Islam became part of my practice, I don't claim to understand how exactly it happened. It wasn't an intellectual decision. It became immediately evident to me that I needed to have some ability to navigate the tradition on my own. I can follow, but I dispositionally tend to prefer other. I'm great at following, but I also have opinions about things, including my following skills, which probably my daughter would be like, no, you're not. Anyhow, I was faced immediately with a lot of people telling me what to do, and I wanted to be able to discern, well, is that something I have to do? Is there a choice? Why should I do that? And that knowledge became really important to me, so I went to study in a seminary, and then I did my PhD. And so it's a mash. I would never have thought that I would do this. I would have thought that I would have been a professor, but I wouldn't have been in this field. But it is. Yeah. And so now I do this, and yeah. so that's the thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so very
my
much
pleasure.
for sharing so richly with us of both your life and your work and why it's important to us. I think we've had a very, very enlightening evening. Thank you so very much. And we're glad you're going to be with us. You and your daughter will be with us tomorrow. So.